Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be giving you an overview of how web applications work. So I'll be showing you from a high level JavaScript, HTML, and CSS and how those things work together to create web applications like this one. I'm going to be focusing on the front end, so I'm not going to be showing you anything about APIs or servers really, but I will be showing you how your browser is able to download all of the information that it needs for the websites that you visit. So like when you go to google.com, what exactly is it doing? What message is it sending to the server? Stuff like that. So yeah, let's just dive right in. So when you want to go to a website, you just type in the address bar the URL of the website that you want to go to. So like google.com or facebook.com or something like that. This URL looks a little bit different. It's just a bunch of numbers, obviously. But it's a special type of URL that's used to communicate with my computer that's just like on my local network. It's not on the internet or anything like that. If you were to type in this URL at your house, it wouldn't work. But yeah, you don't really have to pay attention to that part of this. Just what's important is when you press enter, your browser makes a network request to this URL that you enter, and then some program that's running on a server responds to this network request that you sent. And I have this program open right now called Wireshark that allows me to take a look at all of the network requests that were made by the browser. And it looks like this is the one that was made when we pressed enter. And if I right click here and go to this option, I can take a look at the actual content of the web message that was sent. So most of this stuff isn't super important here, but this part at the top is. So it's saying get, which means that it wants to like fetch a resource, it wants to download something. And then this is the file that we want to download. So we're saying we want to get root, which would be just like the default file on the web server. And in our case, that would be index.html. And then the rest of this stuff isn't super important. Like there's the HTTP version and there's the user agent, which is a little interesting. Like it contains information about the person who made the request, which in this case is me. So it would be information about my web browser that made the request. So we can see like the version of Chrome that I'm using, and there's a bunch of other stuff in here. Like I don't really know why Mozilla is in here and Safari is too, but it has some other useful information like the version of your operating system. So maybe you want to display like a different download button for people on Mac versus Windows. So this is how stuff like that would be done. You just check this string on the web server or in the browser with JavaScript. Okay, so that's how like your browser actually makes a request to get the data. And then we can just look at the response quickly. It will just send back like the actual content of the web server. And it looks like it's not showing in this dialog, but in this one it should. Yeah, so like this is the actual content that the web server sent back when we made that network request. And as you can see, it's just HTML, which is exactly what you're seeing in the browser here. So yeah, so now let's take a look at the actual code for this web application and how that works. So the first network request that was made to our browser or to the web server from our browser was a request to get index.html. So this is what it initially downloaded. The first response just contained this data right here. And this contains a description basically just of our website. So it describes what other files that it needs in order to work, and it also describes the content on our website. So at the top here, you can see that it's referencing style.css, which is just our CSS file, which contains some information about how we should color our text and stuff like that. And then the other file that it references here is main.js. And JS files are JavaScript files, and they contain code that would be executed the same way that you would write like Python or C# code. You would write JavaScript code. Whereas like HTML and CSS, those aren't really like programming languages. They're more description languages. Like there's no way to like call a method in HTML or CSS or anything like that. Whereas in JavaScript, like you can totally do that. Like there's for loops and all those sorts of things. But yeah, so just to give a quick overview of like what HTML actually is, I can just say that the head basically contains all the things that you wouldn't display on the web page. So like you might also put some descriptions up here saying what languages you support, and you can also do like title if you want to set like what is displayed at the top of your tab there. You would put that in the head. So it'd really just be anything that wouldn't be displayed on the screen specifically, at least anything that wouldn't be like displayed inside of this white space, like the content of the web page. All of that goes inside of the body. So like we can see the text for hello world is in there, and this other text is in there, and same with the button. Yeah. So then each one of these things inside of these angle brackets here are called tags, and different tags do different things, obviously, but there really aren't that many different types. Like there are a bunch of different ones that are essentially the same, like div and p and h1. Like they do have their differences, but those ones are pretty similar to each other. Whereas like head is like, that's totally different. You know, there's no head element. It's really just saying that this is where our metadata is located on the web page. But yeah, and then divs are just tags that represent like generic elements, basically. Here I'm just using it as a container. So like both of these things are located together, and I could like style them together, like changing their colors together and stuff like that. And lastly, we just have a button element. And the only thing interesting to note here is that I set the ID attribute. And I gave it a specific name, btn click me, so that I'm able to reference it later in the JavaScript code and also in the CSS. So yeah, so IDs are just one way of like referencing HTML elements from other files like JavaScript and CSS. Yeah, so if I go back to our actual application here and click this button, we just get this nice dialog that pops up and says, hello world. So how does that actually work? Like, where's the code for that? And that is in the JavaScript file right here. So, well, first of all, I should say, how does your browser even know that there is JavaScript that it should run? And it knows about this JavaScript because we explicitly told it inside of the HTML file. So like when your browser downloads this HTML initially, it will see this script tag and download that JavaScript file as well. And we can actually open the dev tools in Google Chrome and look at those requests. So if you go up to these three dots here and then go to more tools and developer tools, you'll just get this window that pops up at the bottom with a few different options here. We got like elements, console, all these things, but what we care about right now is network. And I'm gonna have to refresh the page for the request to show up. But yeah, we can see that, well, actually I need to do a hard refresh where I don't look at the cache and actually download all the files that are possible to be downloaded. And we can see that it made 4 requests actually. So the first request that it made was just to the root of our URL, which is exactly what we typed in at the browser address bar there. And we can see that Chrome gives us an overview of basically the message that was sent, the same way that Wireshark shows us. Like if we go back to the message that was actually sent, we can see that it's a little bit different than what Google Chrome shows us, but it's essentially the same. They have essentially all the same information in there, but I think it's useful to actually see the data for yourself so you can see like what's actually getting sent. Like these are the literal bytes that are sent to the web server, whereas what Google Chrome shows you is just sort of like a high level, not high level, but an overview of what the request was. Like it combines the response and the request. Well, it at least puts them next to each other and then like pulls out common headers and stuff like that, which is useful. I mean, this is the probably the most useful way to have it displayed, but just for learning purposes, it's good to see like what's actually getting sent, and this is that data. But yeah, we can see also at the top here, there's a timeline of the requests that are made, and we can see that this request is made first before any of these other ones, and like once the browser gets a response for this request that it made, so it made a request to slash. Once it gets a response for that request, then it will process all the HTML. So it will see this response, just this HTML right here. It will interpret it and see that there are these two other files that it needs to download, and then it will make requests for both of those. And you can see that it made requests for style and main at basically the same time. Like you can see they're very close in time right there when those requests were initiated. And it made a fourth request here for favicon.ico, and we don't have one of those files, but that is the icon that would be displayed right there at your tab, or in the tab. As you can see, I don't have one of those files, but if I did, it would download it and display the icon right there. But it has no way of knowing if that file exists or not, so it just makes the request hoping that it exists, and then if it doesn't exist, it just silently fails. Yeah. And another thing that's really useful to look at in the browser is the Elements tab. So this shows you all of the HTML that is like laid out on your screen. So you can just like right click on something, inspect it, and it will take you to the line of HTML that describes the UI that you're looking at. So like, I right clicked on this, so it just highlights this P paragraph tag for me in these in this developer console, which is super useful. And I can just like hover over these things, and it shows me like what each one of these elements correspond to. And like when I hover over div, which contains both of these two things, then it will highlight both of them. So yeah, but let's get back into how this button actually works and how this JavaScript code is run. So once again, when I click the button, we get this dialog to show up with a nice hello world message, and that's it. So I was saying that behavior is defined in this JavaScript file. So like all behavior, all actions, anything that's interactive on your web page would be done with JavaScript code. Yeah, so this is just a super simple example of using some JavaScript to trigger an alert. So when your browser downloads a JavaScript file, it will immediately execute it. So as soon as this file is downloaded, it will execute these two lines of code, which are just function definitions. It'll just like store the code inside of these functions for later. And then it will execute line 10. And all this does is add an event listener. So it's saying like when all of the content has been loaded, like once you have displayed this text on the screen, then I want you to call this function on page ready. So I have this other function, which like I said, will just be called when the application has been initialized. So like I can access everything that's on the web page. And that's important because I want to get the button element. I want to get a reference to this literal element right here, and then add an event listener for when it's clicked. So yeah, I don't want to get into like the specific details here. I just want to show you like from a high level basically what's possible. So I'm just like getting the button element. I have a line of code to like get a reference to that, and then I'm just adding an event listener to it, which is just a function that'll be called when the click event is triggered. And your browser is responsible for doing all of this. So someone wrote some C++ code at Google to call my function on button clicked when I actually click this button in the browser here. So that's how it's going on. There's no like library or anything like that. This is just pure JavaScript code calling code that your browser knows how to run. So yeah, and then if you just look at the body of this on button clicked function, it just does one thing, which is call this alert function, which just displays an alert that the browser itself is displaying here. There's no like HTML or CSS describing this dialog because this is part of Google Chrome. Yeah, and if we look at the sources tab in our browser, we can actually look at all this code that it downloaded. So if we go to sources here and then main.js, we can see this code that it downloaded and executed. And just like in PyCharm or IntelliJ or VS Code or whatever IDE you've used for like writing Java code or anything like that, you can set breakpoints, which will pause the execution of your application and allow you to like poke around the state of the application. So like if I just put a breakpoint on line 2, which means I want the application to pause when it is about to execute line 2 and allow me to look around. So when I click this button, it won't show the alert. It'll pause right here on line 2 and show me like some variables that are defined. Like I can see this button element. Like when I hover over it, it highlights it on the web page. Shows me what functions have been called. There's not really much to look at here, but it's just very useful to know that this is an option. Like if you're writing some JavaScript that's like even 10 lines or 20 lines or something like that, it can be useful to use this debugger to just step in there and see what's going on with your code. Yeah, and when I hit play, it actually showed the alert. Alright, so now we've looked at HTML and JavaScript, which is used to introduce behavior into our applications. The last piece of the puzzle is CSS. And CSS is just used to describe how the application should look and how it should be laid out. Now, I don't really have any CSS in here that does layout. I just only change colors because layout's a bit more complicated. But just know that you can change layout with CSS. Like I could put this button like up here next to this text, or this text next to this text, or something like that. You can really change things around with CSS. But it's mainly for like styling. That's the word that's used to encapsulate both like position and color is style. Okay, so we just have a couple CSS rules here. We have one rule for changing H1 elements. We want their color to be dark orange. So that's saying like the text color basically should be dark orange for any elements who are of type H1. So remember, if we go back to our HTML here, we can see that the tag that we used for this hello world header is H1. So it just knows that anytime we have an H1 now, that it will that'll style it orange. And then for this other button, we do something a little bit fancier here. So instead of just saying like all buttons should have a background of sky blue, which would be which would look like this, background like that. This would make every single button always have a background of sky blue, but that's not what we want. We want only this button to have a background of sky blue when we hover over it. So that's what the CSS is saying. And once again, I don't really want to get into the specifics, but it's just important to know that you can apply styles conditionally based on some sort of property like hover, or if something has been clicked, like if a link has been clicked, you can also style it conditionally based on that. And there are a few other things, and you can also target specific elements. So if you don't want every button to be the same color, let's say you want like a primary button and a secondary button on your form, like a confirm and a cancel, then you would want probably one to be like a primary color, like a purple, like a dark purple would be continue, and maybe like a gray for cancel. So you can do that with CSS. You can say like I only want this specific button with the ID btn click me to have a background color of sky blue when it's hovered. And the thing that's really nice about Google Chrome and really any browser like Safari and Firefox and Edge is they have these tools that allow you to modify CSS on the fly. So you can just like right click on an element, hit inspect, and with the element highlighted, like with it selected here, you can see all of the CSS rules that are applied to this element. And these ones that are in italics down here, these are ones that are applied by the browser. It says user agent, and that just means like the browser, basically, like the user agent, the application who is like interpreting this HTML and displaying it on the screen. They have their own style that they use to differentiate H1 elements from like paragraph elements and other elements. But yeah, the ones that aren't in italics are the ones that we defined. And you can even see that it has a reference right there to like where this rule lives. It lives in style CSS on line 1. And yep, that's accurate. Yeah, we can go back to the elements and we can just uncheck this box and it'll change the text back to black. Or we could even just edit this to be like red or green or anything like that, and it just changes right on the fly. So I highly recommend whenever you're doing anything with CSS to just try it in the browser. There's no reason to like edit a CSS file and hope it works when you can just right click on the element and apply the rules on the fly. Yeah, and like for this situation where we have a hover rule, the browser even allows us to simulate a hover. Like I can right click on this, hit inspect, and see we don't have that background rule, that background color rule applied, but I can hit this button and it allows me to like check any of those conditional boxes, like hover. You know, I only want to have a style when the user is hovered over it, and it allows me to like simulate that. And you can see like now we see this rule here and we see those rules applied in the actual browser, so we can preview what it looks like when you're hovering over it. So yeah, I guess the point just is that Google Chrome and all browsers like offer a lot of really good dev tools to make the experience of web development much easier. You know, you can debug your JavaScript, you can fiddle with your CSS on the fly, you can even edit HTML on the fly. Like I can even go in here and just delete that, and now it's gone. And I can even say edit as HTML and just add anything back like hello world 2 or 1 or 2. And how do I submit it? And there, yeah, see, it added it right in there. So yeah, Google Chrome is really great with all these DevTool things. But yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to cover. So I hope you found this informative. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them.